Okay, I would very much like to start now. So welcome everyone. This is going to be the first webinar in a series on COVID-19 organized by the Athena Institute of the VU. And we are very happy to have you all with us. And the idea of today is that we're going to give you more or less of an overview, an introduction to the entire series. And well, why COVID-19? Well, it goes beyond saying, we would almost say, because of much of the world today ended up in crisis because of COVID-19. And going out of that crisis is not an easy route. And for us within the Athena Institute, having our mission about using science and technology for the better of the world in a fair and equitable and responsible way, of course, our focus on how to go beyond this crisis in a fair, equitable and a responsible way is a logical one. And one thing is for sure, there is no magic bullet and no bullets either. There's a lot to do about the vaccine at one point. Well, that will save us. It's not going to be likely to be the vaccine that will do that. Is it going to be group immunity, like our Prime Minister at one point mentioned as the way forward? Well, given some of the realities of today, we know that's not going to be the solution either, at least not on the short term. So there are no magic bullets. We will argue in this webinar series that knowledge and value articulation is required. Basically because disciplinary approaches do not suffice. We need much more than just simple disciplinary thinking. What we need is participatory multi-stakeholder systems thinking. But it's not going to be easy in cases of urgency and time constraint. So we have lots of years of experience in developing methodologies to do this. Given the rough circumstances, we need a platform. We need a platform to think about, is this indeed the way to go? How to go about it? And what can we learn from this crisis? Also in this respect. So let's start with the knowledge, because that's as in the Science Institute, the knowledge is one of the first things we are interested in. Now, many disciplines are involved. Of course, the virus is central. But initially, don't forget, we didn't know this picture, we couldn't draw it. The first most important discipline that started off was basically biomedical sciences, because we needed to know we see symptoms, we see something new, but what is it? So biomedical science was the first discipline to unveil the mystery. And it continues to be important because how does it spread? What's immunity? How long will it take? Etc., etc. Multiple questions. Medical science, of course, because how can we treat it? How do we deal with patients having it? Medical science is center, but also public health, because it's not just treatment of patients, there's a whole range of containment strategies, how to go about it. What we see is that these three disciplines have been very central in the crisis. So these three disciplines, like in the Netherlands, we have the outbreak management team, but in many other countries, it is these three sciences that are central in dealing with the crisis at first. But if it turns out that the normal strategies that we have don't work, that everything goes out of hand, and we need to go to a lockdown, or at least that is thought, that's the decision taken at one point, then suddenly we need to move towards behavior, because people have to oblige by certain rules. We have to communicate these rules. How to do that? So actually, what we saw that also was central in the crisis is communication units, comprising of psychologists and behavioral scientists advising on what to do. So this is the second cluster of sciences disciplines that we saw as central in making decisions. But of course, we also have the social sciences. What does it do in society? What does it do to what does isolation mean to people? But not to forget economics and innovation. Economics in the sense of what does the lockdown do to the economy, businesses, but also how can we make use of it? How do we innovate now in such times of constraints? And once there is a vaccine, how do we get it to the market, or a treatment, how do we get it to the market? How do we innovate? Laws and ethics, if we have rules and regulations, how do we make them? And what about rights involved in that? Very central. And if we don't know, because there's no precedent and we can't turn easily to the future, what do? We look back. So what in the past were similar situations that have occurred, or similar to what extent, to some extent at least, and how can we learn from history perhaps to tell us something about the future? But this is just a collection, just an initial one, because there are many more disciplines and they're all relevant. So what do we see with the knowledge in such a crisis? It's limited and fragmented. One of the first things that the outbreak management team said is, wait a minute, this goes far beyond the medical sciences, the biomedical and the public health. We need much more knowledge. It's not just us, but it needs to be integrated, which is not. There's actually no evidence base on which containment strategy works best under what circumstances. We really don't know. There are no models for anticipating the future. Our Dutch Institute of Public Health says our models work at least, well, at most 2 months ahead. After that, we don't know. Facts and fiction. We even had a television program going about it, facts and fiction. What do we know? What do we not know? And of course, if there is a time of so much uncertainty, fiction comes in, but even in some cases, do we know for sure it's fiction? Like the origin of the virus. Is it really from a marketplace in Wuhan, or is it actually the lab, the virus lab that's there, only 5 kilometers from that marketplace? We still are not, there's lots of debate about it, pros and cons. Some say it's fiction, others say it's facts. Sometimes it's more clearly fiction, like the idea that Bill Gates is the evil genius behind the pandemic. But also, don't forget, there are all sorts of ideas on how to treat it. And most of them are quite unlikely to be, this is a medical, between brackets, miracle mineral supplement, which is actually based on chloride, which is a detergent. It's indeed a fierce enemy of bacteria and viruses, but does it work in the body? It's quite dangerous. But on the other hand, what about the treatment against malaria? It's still quite contested whether it works or doesn't work, or if it works, whether it doesn't have too many side effects. So we see a lot of blurring between facts and fiction, basically because of the uncertainty of knowledge. And decision-making in a time of uncertain knowledge becomes something like what our Prime Minister said in the Netherlands: we have to make the 100% of the decision on the basis of less than 50% of the knowledge required. And what we saw in this crisis, that basically it was like driving into fog, however, on autopilot with accelerating speed. And what do you do then? If you have only 50% of the knowledge for the decisions at that point in time, you just hit the emergency brake and hope that nothing is behind you that immediately bangs on you. And then if you pull out the plug, then you can try to go step by step and then sort of balancing between facts and public opinion. And at least that's what's happening in the Netherlands. And when you talk about public opinion and expert knowledge, there's also a lot of balancing in values. And that's the next thing. Besides knowledge, you have the values coming in. We have the values about right to care. For whom? And what sort of care? Does everybody have the right to an intensive care? And when intensive care beds are limiting, who has access and who decides? And next, to what extent do we protect those who are vulnerable? Vulnerable people are there to be protected, but to what extent? You have you have the right to a healthy environment, but people also have the right to meet. So to what extent is the freedom versus protection? So your freedom, our Prime Minister said it again, your freedom should not go at the expense of somebody else's health. But is that unlimited? And then we have, of course, the remedy and the disease. After all, the remedy should not be worse than the disease. But is it at the moment when we don't really know about costs and benefits? And costs are so diverse. And we see lots of inequity in the costs and benefits. How do we balance? We see problems between local and global. We actually see now that because of the globalization, that certain things are outsourced. Like, did you know that we don't make masks in the Netherlands? They're not there. They're being produced in France. They're being produced in China. China was willing to share, but was unable to produce, and not always at the quality that we want. France had them, but they said, we're not going to share because we need them ourselves. So what to do about it? Solidarity between generations, short-term versus long-term loss of value. Younger people are not so vulnerable to the disease, but we are now actually paying, they also have to share in the rules. And at the same time, we have lots of money being spent on businesses to keep them up straight, while at the same time, this is something that will have to be paid back later by the younger generation. So there are lots of moral dilemmas to be taken care of, and they're not shared easily. Yeah? So people have different opinions about them. And then we have the whole thing of never waste a good crisis. But we all see old worldviews coming back that people already had for a long time, and thinking about how can this crisis help me realize the worldview that I had already. It's not that new worldviews come in, but we know that a crisis breaks up, solidified structures and opens up opportunities. So we could also use it to realize certain ideals that we already had for some time, but were constrained for that. So what we see is that we are in multiple crises. We have, of course, the public health crisis. That's clear, it's a health problem. But we also have an economic crisis, a moral crisis, a crisis of equality, and as what I started with, we have a knowledge crisis. But there is more. We have a food crisis in Africa, or at least it's likely to happen. We have the crisis of democracy in Hungary, where we see dictatorship taking its chances of realizing its goals. We have a crisis of privacy. China is an excellent example where this is happening, but we also have a crisis of international solidarity. Like, borders are everywhere, it's protectionism everywhere. So where is this solidarity? So, and we might even have more ones. We might even exacerbate our environmental crisis or our energy crisis. We don't know. So lots of things happening at the same time. Basically, the corona crisis is an unstructured problem. Yeah, there is no certainty about the relevant knowledge. There's no consensus about relevant norms and values, so we are in the no-no corner. It's an unstructured problem. Now, what policy science tells us, if we are in the corner of the unstructured problem, science becomes a problem recognizer. It's helping to articulate the knowledge and provide pointers where we need to try to bring together all the different sorts of knowledge, not only academic knowledge, but also experiential knowledge, practical knowledge. And basically policy becomes a learning process. Okay, that's nice. But don't forget, we are in a complex system. Systems are collectives of organizations, institutions, resources that go for a certain purpose. So it's a certain function. In case of the health system, it is the function to improve health. There are many interconnections between the different parts, but at the same time, it may lead to synergies, trade-offs, but the interconnections are complex, the dynamics are complex, so we don't know exactly what's happening in a system. So what happens if one of the stones falls? We don't really know. And if we put up we put up a new stone, we also don't know what happens. So this complexity is inherent, it's structural. Systems are coupled, so the health system doesn't function in isolation from the food system, the energy system, etc., etc. So that actually means that we would argue that in such circumstances, we need to go for system thinking. The complexity is so high, we need to try to understand it in a holistic way as much as possible. We need to try to understand the interconnections. We need to see the unified view of the whole. So fragmentation and compartmentalization. We need to go beyond that as quickly as possible. And try to anticipate as much as possible. Even if we can't look further than 2 months, we can set it up like a learning process. We are in a continuous experiment anyway already. Like nobody knew what was going to happen to the lockdown. So we need to go from the linear thinking, the circular, we really need to go to that complex system thinking. Requirement 2 is that science cannot do it alone. Science cannot do it in separate disciplines. It really cannot do it just by itself. We need a variety of stakeholders to talk about it. We need to include the diversity and then integrate that through a joint reflection and learning process. Do it together and collaboratively construct actions. But there is one problem. We don't have much time, right? Can we do it in this time that is there? How can we do it still in a fair and equitable way when we see that actually in many cases it are those that are most vulnerable, the elderly, but also the ones that are already in low socioeconomic positions. Speed usually goes at the expense of fairness and equitability. So how to balance all these things? That's really what we definitely would like to discuss with you. High urgency, high stakes, but how still to realize it? We will do that through actually having 3 angles. We start with the first 2 webinars on knowledge systems. So talking about the knowledge crisis a little bit more. First of all, what's mine is yours. Accelerating R&D responses during outbreaks of emerging infectious diseases. Well, that's this, huh? Which crisis? Whose evidence? Robust, inclusive evidence for rapid outbreak guidance. The first one is hosted by Linda van der Burgwal. The third webinar is hosted by Teun Zuiderint, Irak. Then we go to the COVID-19 societal effects. Large effects at the margins. Webinar 5 on the epidemiological transition undone? Question mark. And the third theme will be engagement and sense making, the opportunities for public engagement, and last but not least, sense making in times of COVID-19, facts and fiction, role of science communicators. Well, this is some of the things he would like to share with you. And I think that I would like to now give the word to some of the presenters, some of the hosts of the next webinars, to give you a bit of an appetizer. What we will do afterwards, after the brief pitches, we will have time for discussion, of course, because a webinar is also want to be a platform after all. So definitely we would like to give some opportunities, but first, just the pitches for the different webinars. So I will do my unshare screen, and then would like to give the word. Teun, can I give the word to you? Would you be interested? Is that a good idea?
Yes, I think Linda has arrived. Linda, are you there? Otherwise, I take it.
Yes, I am here. I can.
No, then we will start with Linda, because Linda, I know you had some constraints children-wise. That's another thing of the lockdown, huh?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. One of the consequences, unforeseen initially.
Yes. So can you see my presentation screen now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So in the webinar, What is Mine is Yours, we will go into the need for rapid data sharing that is apparent in times of outbreaks. Oh, I will also put on my video. We will go into the need for rapid data sharing that is apparent in times of outbreaks. So stakeholders across the valorization cycle actually need to collaborate. So stakeholders from science, stakeholders from industry, stakeholders in the public discourse, so what we call the market, citizens, end users of products, but also stakeholders from a society perspective. So like Jacqueline said, it's not simple, and it's a simple picture that we show here, but it's not a linear or a circular approach, because all these stakeholders need to collaborate. And they need to accelerate that collaboration, preferably in an open science approach. So we want everyone to share the data that they have. But also we need to be reflective of the fact that there are systemic incentives and barriers in place that hamper that sharing. If you are an industry partner, you are evaluated based on the IP that you generate and how you transform that into money. If you are a scientist, you are evaluated based on the publications that you write, preferably in high impact journals. So there are all these systemic barriers in place that limit this sharing. So how do we deal with that? And then we say, okay, we just share everything, but from a patient perspective, that's not what we want, because if we share everything, there is no way to make a profit, and therefore no reason to make an investment for companies. That is just the system that we are in. So in the end, there will be no product or cure or treatment. And of course, in times of these outbreaks, these facts that we know, that the way the system works change, because there is a lot of public funding for these steps, but still we need to be aware, does this make sense for companies to invest in? Does it make sense for scientists to invest their time in this? So data sharing is very important, and we see that it has many different dimensions. So data sharing across sectors, we know, or we think we know, that the coronavirus originated from bats. So we need to take into the animal health, we need to take into account the human health. We also see a lot of diseases happening in across the food industry. So there are a lot of aspects that come into place and a lot of data that needs to be shared across locations and maybe even across pathogens. So do we know it's just a virus, and how does it interact with other infections? And also across time. So all these data sharing needs to occur to inform public health action, to inform public health policy, but also to inform innovation. And then there are a lot of regulations coming into play. So we will go into all of these in the webinar. And then the question, of course, is how can we accelerate it? So what can we learn from earlier outbreaks and innovation barriers? What can we learn on data sharing? What approaches are in development to remedy those barriers, and how do they compare? So do those approaches really help? And what role can novel technologies play in facilitating this? So can we build upon novel technologies to accelerate those responses? So to really go into the innovation part of vaccines, of diagnostics, of antivirals, that is what this webinar is about.
Thank you. Linda, I'm going to be there. I want to know, I want to see. Thanks.
Very good. Very good.
Then we go to webinar 3.
Yes, I think you should be able to see this one now. Yes, in the third webinar, it quite nicely links to the theme of how do you deal with the fact that ideas about sharing knowledge widely, as Linda just explained, when thinking about that, you still have to acknowledge that there were lots of interests in the production of that knowledge, how to balance that and what kind of possibilities there are for that. In a way, the second webinar picks up slightly later in the trail, and it deals with the production of outbreak guidance. There's a huge shift going on currently in the world of guidance development. The system that was set up for developing evidence-based guidelines has a few particular features, and we'll be going through them, but also go through how those speak to the current situation of rapid outbreak guidance. Because evidence-based guidelines in a way has come up, as evidence-based guideline development as a way has come up in response to concerns about those interests in knowledge production, and especially the problem of conflict of interest. So pharmaceutical companies trying to push a certain drug mostly, and trying to make sure it gets used a lot, irrespective of its exact effectiveness. So evidence-based guideline development has focused on good knowledge as having a very high internal validity through causality that's often established in large studies. The values that were built into EBM are about, statistical confidence, trying to focus on statistical confidence, because that is seen as one of the ways to keep out conflict of interest. And the infrastructures that have been developed to develop guidance are knowledge appraisal systems that work with an evidence hierarchy, where knowledge that is working with larger data sets, that is frequentist in nature, has an inherently higher value. Now, of course, it's well known also to guideline developers that that leads to marginalized knowledge and marginalized actors. But that is mostly seen as a kind of collateral damage. Like, that's what you have to, like, yes, you will be excluding certain knowledges and certain actors, but you also want to exclude certain actors, especially those with vested interest that may try to influence your knowledge appraisal in problematic ways. And of course, there's considered judgment in guidance development, where you can include different knowledges. Now, this system is quite different than what guideline developers are doing right now. They have to develop guidance at breakneck speed, basically. And good knowledge in the current guidance development approaches is more about finding out complex mechanisms, focusing on ecological validity, not so much what's the validity within the study design, but what is the value of this knowledge in the real world. At the same time, the value needs to be, it's got to be fast but right. It's one of the slogans that's used to explain outbreak guidance. The pace is one of the most important parts, but the knowledge has to be robust. The knowledge infrastructure is a kind of a hybrid arrangement of evidence, quality appraisal tools for a wide range of types of knowledge, but also experts. Expert knowledge is very central in this type of guidance development. That also has it comes with a very different role for marginalized knowledge and actors. The problem in outbreak guidance is that if you accept marginalization of certain types of knowledge or certain actors, you may risk losing the effectiveness for all. The case of India is clearest, where a lockdown was imposed that then, by excluding the fact that this lockdown would need to apply to a number of day wagers, it actually produced an exodus of people traveling because they no longer had a place to stay or work and food. So the inclusion of actors and different types of knowledge has to be tackled upfront. But how do you do it, especially when many of the experts are also frontline workers, are also involved in managing the outbreak at the front line? Now, together with the Guidelines International Network, we are running a rapid survey, and that we're doing with I do that with two colleagues, Julia Rijma, one of our master students, and Marlijn Moleman, one of our PhD students. We're running a rapid survey about what guideline developers are currently doing. And one of the things we asked them in the rapid survey now was, are your current approaches to guidance development up for the job that you have to face? And 80% of those guidance developers said, no, they're not. We have to improvise. We have to do all kinds of stuff that we usually don't do. So that's the type of questions we're going to be focusing on in this webinar. How are they doing it? So how do guideline developers currently appraise and include a wide range of knowledge to come to robust guidance? There's been people who've been doing work on that for a number of years, so we'll get some experts to speak on that. But also, how do you do that without resorting to expert opinion without empirical checks and balances? Because the more rigorous evidence appraisal was also a way to not rely too much on experts. And in a way, guidance development is now relying so heavily on experts that you wonder, it seems to go at the risk of the scientific robustness, but also on the societal robustness to some extent. So that then leads to a third question. We'll be addressing how to balance the harms and the benefits and the efficiencies of guidance, especially when the marginalized communities actually risk ending up paying the highest price. You don't just see that in low and middle income countries. We see that as well.
Oh, thanks a lot. We're now going to webinar 4.
I think that's me.
I hope so. Yeah.
I'm sharing my screen, but it's on the wrong.
In the meantime, if you as listeners at this point feel something comes up in your mind and you say, oh, I would like to discuss this later on, or I would like to make a remark on that one, don't hesitate to put it in the chat. Because that helps for later on, then we already have a number of things in the chat that we can use later on for the discussion. So,
yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. So while the first 2 webinars are about COVID-19 and the knowledge and innovation system, number 4 and 5 are about the societal effects of the pandemic. And the first one of these is titled Large Effects at the Margins. So what we have witnessed over the past few months is that while the virus on the one hand doesn't make a distinction between people on the basis of culture or economic or social background, perhaps on age, of course, and apparently also whether you have been vaccinated for BMR, perhaps. But the COVID-19 containment measures, they have affected different people highly unevenly. So that will be the topic of the 4th webinar. So take, for instance, the thousands of school children in the Netherlands that have disappeared out of the sight of teachers, or they have no place or equipment to work from home or no support from their parents. And of course, there's quite a lot of growing enthusiasm and different possibilities with the online work for all of us, for people working from home, but also possibilities of e-health and online education. I think it's all working much better than anticipated, but it has also really made the digital divide more visible than ever. Another example is all the children, but also adults that are exposed to an increased risk of domestic violence. Oh, I should do my clicking, sorry. And the challenges this also poses to youth care workers, for instance, of finding ways to assess risks from a distance, not being able to visit the homes. Or, as Teun already briefly referred to, all these countries where the informal employment sector is the largest sector, 70% or more of people working as a day laborer, they have instantly lost their income, their livelihood provision with the lockdown. And with hardly any savings, they actually say we are dying from hunger rather than from corona. And of course, as Teun also said, the travel that was induced by this lockdown has again not been effective at all in terms of preventing the disease to spread. So basically, the largest effects of this pandemic have clearly been experienced by those already at the societal margins. In this webinar, we will explore these issues and related issues, and more importantly, we will also look at the responses that this has triggered. Of course, many people in different sectors have tried to mitigate these effects, and we will try to learn from support structures that have come up or are still lacking, but also really think about how the resilience can be fostered in a more sustainable way. For instance, well, we will also draw from different projects at Athena to explore, how what has happened. For instance, with our partner in India, the Center for Equity Studies in Delhi, they're implementing aid relief for those in hunger, but also doing a lot of policy advocacy for change. In Amsterdam, we're working with the municipality on strategies to close the digital divide and explore how professionals and policymakers can learn from and with those at the margins. And there are other examples also to come. So if you would like to explore these issues with us, please join on Monday, the 8th of June at 10:30.
Very nice, Barbara. Next, webinar 5. Cherkjan?
I guess that's me.
Yes, I think so.
A very interesting introduction to this webinar series. Yeah, so as part of this series, I'm going to talk about the epidemiological transition. And it's also an exploratory webinar in the sense that it's a question mark. Is it undone? The epidemiological transition is a concept that describes that we used to fight infectious diseases, but we kind of won. So we don't have polio or measles on a larger scale, but they were replaced by non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, etc. So we have made a great shift from these pandemics to more lifestyle-related diseases. This is the epidemiological transition. And obviously, when you think of me telling this, you think, wait, but now we have COVID-19. So is it undone? So this pandemic background of the healthcare system is the point of departure of the discussion that we will have, because the current healthcare system is mainly based in this context of fighting pandemics. It started out around the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, and there were a lot of infectious diseases that were the result of poverty of the working class and bad hygiene. And you can think of pictures like this, where you can see the sewage system and the potable water system quite close to each other, and these conditions caused huge outbreaks. So in response to those situations, there were a lot of collective arrangements. Cities started to build clean potable water systems and sewage systems, but also alongside with these systems, hospitals and medical training emerged. We talk about the birth of the professional. In that time, also the medical knowledge emerged and grew bigger and bigger, and governments started to invest in medical knowledge and medical training. So you see collective interventions, collective arrangements like clean drinking water, and the emergence of the medical system as we have it now. And this was extremely successful, which obviously led to new challenges. So here you see the costs of the most important diseases in the Netherlands. This is from last year. And there you have psychiatric diseases or cardiovascular diseases, cancer. And then if you follow this all along to the upper right, then you see infectious diseases. So this was the situation before COVID-19 happened. So that's the point of departure. Has this been undone? And obviously part of the answer is, well, not really, because next to COVID-19, next to these infectious diseases that have come back, this pandemic, we still have diabetes patients, about 1.2 million. We still have cancer patients, about 600,000. We still have all the other non-communicable diseases as well. So this might even mean that we get into a situation where there's a double burden of disease, usually associated with third world countries, that we now have that in the Netherlands again. But again, this is a question. So we will have several panel members discussing what they think about this transition and whether it happened or not. Two, what we do have is the rapid emergence of collective interventions. And you could also say that social distancing now is a new clean, potable drinking water. We have successful and extremely expensive preventive measures. So in response to this pandemic, the Dutch society, or all societies basically, found it in their veins, in their way of organizing, means to start to attack this pandemic in a very, very expensive and expansive way. So the second question we will debate is, can we harness some of that preventive power to also fight non-communicable diseases? We do still have them. They did not disappear, even though the hospitals tried to switch to larger ICs. Those are all still there. So can we harness some of that preventive power to fight those diseases? Can we do something about lifestyle-related diseases? If we are able to tell people that they should stay inside, can we also invite them to stop smoking, for instance? So in what ways can transdisciplinary approaches, knowledge articulation by multiple stakeholders like Jacqueline introduced, and systems thinking support sustainable health and care? And that was my last slide. We will discuss this on June 15th at, I think, 12 o'clock.
Thanks a lot. Let me see, because I've lost all my controls at the moment. Can anybody hear me? Yeah, okay, good. I see it coming back, great. The next one, we are now moving to the third theme. And I think it's Frank. Frank is muted.
Can you see the screen I'm sharing?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's now visible.
Okay, thank you very much. The final two webinars will focus on science in public. They will focus on the conversation and dialogue about COVID-19 as a scientific and also as a societal problem. The first one, opportunities for public engagement, will focus on organized dialogue as a way to gather input for research and policy making. The second one, sense making of Corona, will focus on the debate and dialogue that is going on in society anyway. So I will introduce these final two webinars to you, starting with the one on Tuesday, June 23, about opportunities for public engagement. I will try to be brief. This webinar takes the starting point that Jacqueline already mentioned in her introduction, the idea of the COVID-19 outbreak as a complex problem. So a problem that is high in uncertainty and diversity of values. Already in 1993, Ravets and Funtrich described this class of problems as having a number of destabilizing features that you can recognize in the Corona outbreak as well. So there's a lot of uncertainty involved about what is the case, but also about which facts are or should be seen as relevant. There are values in dispute, although in the COVID-19 context, this might be a bit more subtle. Health is a dominant value for almost all of us, but people are making different trade-offs in relation to other values. The stakes are high and decisions are urgent. So Rabbits and Finchweeds already said this asks for a different kind of science. Like Jacqueline said, we need a joint approach of learning and problem solving. We need a transdisciplinary science. This means that we have to think about whose expertise is relevant to include. We have seen that in this phase of the outbreak that we are now in, people, also the outbreak management team itself, are asking for different types of expertise to be involved. But what about citizens? Shouldn't citizens become involved as well? Now, the literature recognizes three general motives for the engagement of citizens. The first is that they have knowledge to offer, knowledge to contribute to the solution of the problem. The second is that you also need people's acceptance and their cooperation to make policies work. So that's a more instrumental argument. And last but not least, this crisis is affecting all of us, so we also have the right to say something about it. And it's remarkable how much freedom people are also willing to give away or temporarily put on hold in the face of this pandemic. But these are important values and rights to take into the discussion. So what if we want to broaden reflection to not only to a larger variety of stakeholders, but also to citizens? This will lead to various questions that we will discuss in this webinar. First of all, what are actually the relevant issues to talk about? And who gets to decide what is the relevant issue? So this is about framing of the problem. A second question is, what are the values that are at stake? And again, who gets to frame the problem and to decide what kind of values and arguments are relevant? The third question is, whose voice matters? Who is or should be invited at the table and contribute to this framing of the problem and also exploration of different alternatives? A fourth relevant question to ask is, what kind of interaction spaces are needed? So how should this table be organized? What kind of mechanisms for participation and decision making do we need? In the Netherlands, we've seen an example of participatory value creation, which is a kind of a smart survey that quickly generates a lot of information about people's preferences and the trade-offs that they make. Or should we need do we need more interactive relational mechanisms where people can actually meet and join the dialogue? And then finally, there's of course a question about how to integrate participation mechanisms into ongoing research, policymaking, and action to either contain the pandemic or transition to a new phase. Now, in the Athena Institute, we have a lot of experience and expertise gathered in the past decades on dealing with these questions. And during the webinar, we will use this experience and expertise to discuss different opportunities for public engagement. For example, reflecting on which type of public engagement is needed. Do we only need to consult different publics or actually collaborate with them to co-create policies or strategies? On which aspect of outbreak management should citizens or publics be engaged? Is it in the management and communication about risks, or already in how we approach, define risks, and on what kind of areas should we talk about public engagement. Is it in the choice for different exit strategies? We've already seen in the Netherlands a sort of semi-transparent experiment regarding the contact tracing app that is developed. It can, well, what kind of public engagement is required to make sure that such an app is designed in accordance with the public values that are at stake. The same goes for public surveillance technologies. So we will make use of our own research. For example, the research of one of our PhD students, Sophie Kemper, that is together with the Dutch Institute for Public Health, actually at the moment researching the opportunities for public engagement in the COVID-19 outbreak. But we will also invite other experiences and other expertise outside our institution. So that's the first webinar, and I think I will just immediately go on to the final webinar, the 7th webinar in this series, which is about the conversation in society that is going on anyway, and does have via different channels and platforms quite some influence on policy making and on decision making. So why do we need to talk about sense making? Because the COVID-19 outbreak highlighted two interrelated issues that have been complicating public communication about science and technology for a while. The first issue is that very generally the boundaries between science and society are blurring. So there are more and different connections between science and society. There's more collaboration, for example, in transdisciplinary research, but there is also more discussion and more controversy. Now, if you extend the range of actors that is involved in these collaborations, but also discussions about science, also the range of issues that are or should be discussed gets extended. In a slogan phrase, this means that society speaks back to science. Now, the second related trend is that we have seen a digital revolution, digitalization of the media. More different players and platforms have become involved, and which is also very important, internet communication gives access to backstage conversations. So, for example, you can now see two epidemiologists on Twitter disagreeing about what the right models are to project the pandemic. Or to project the number of people at the intensive care. They are discussing their models, their assumptions, their methods in public for everyone to see and for everyone to join. A third feature of the digitalization of the media is that everyone's a journalist now, or at least can be. Everyone can contribute to either the spread of information or generating new information. Now, what does this reality imply? That science, and especially the type of science that is happening now, the post-normal science that Ravets and Funtrich talked about, is taking place in public. And we have to realize that discussions about facts are always also discussions about values. So our attention should go to the processes through which knowledge, values, relations between different actors, framings of the issues are communicated. Our attention should go to the different ways that issues are framed and the conflicts that are residing in these different framings. And we should look at the different roles and responsibilities of actors involved. At the Athena Institute, we are doing research into these aspects also in respect to the COVID-19 outbreak. And we use the concept of sense-making to guide our research. Sense-making is the process by which we develop an understanding of a complex reality. We've seen throughout this webinar that the corona crisis is a complex phenomenon. It is very uncertain in terms of its future, in terms of the facts that we need to base our decisions. It is ambiguous in terms of that it means different things when we take a different perspective. Now, sense-making always happens from a particular perspective and is always limited and incomplete because this reality is so complex and the way we understand it is always fragmented and temporal. By the way, this is the same for lay people and scientists. So this is actually what makes these public examples of sense-making, the example that I gave about 2 epidemiologists on Twitter, so interesting and also so complex to handle. This morning I read an article in the Dutch newspaper Parool, which argued that science has a communication problem. Normally, science is only communicated when it's finished, when there's a new breakthrough, a planet that has been discovered or a drug that has been developed. But now we have to talk about science when it's not finished, when it's still in the making. So at the Athena Institute, we are doing this research in the context of a European project that is called Rethink. I'm involved in this project just like Tessa Rudema, one of our PhD students, and Virgil Rerimassi, one of our postdoc researchers that will also contribute to the webinar. And we will discuss questions like these you see listed here. So what are the dynamics of communication? How do people actually respond to uncertainties, beliefs, claims that are made by scientists or politicians? How do they make sense of these uncertainties and claims? What are the best strategies? If we know how people make sense about such an outbreak, what are then the best strategies to build open and trustworthy relationships? And what are the different roles and responsibilities of the actors involved? Scientists, politicians, but especially also science communicators. So these are the questions of this final webinar. Now back to you, Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you. I think many interesting questions and not easy to answer, and that's exactly why we want to post them, because then we can nicely discuss about them. So I hope these questions have triggered you as well, and eagerly to find out more, but also to discuss about it. Before, Tjerk-Jan, are you around? Yes. Sergio, I would first, before going into the discussion questions, Barbara, just that 2 questions were posed by the audience about the brief presentations, the pitches. So there's one for Tjerk-Jan and there's one for you, Barbara. I would like to start with Tjerk-Jan. You can see this one from Sergio. How would you like to react to that?
Yes, thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you for the question. Yeah, so the question is, what can we learn from previous outbreaks, previous pandemics? So there's many ways to go into that question. I will take the approach from the healthcare system as it is, because interestingly, I find that the healthcare system in the Netherlands is doing exactly what it was devised to do. So the healthcare system as such is responding according to the biomedical and epidemiological knowledge it is based on. So that knowledge is also still leading. You see that expert knowledge is taking over policy making. So the knowledge is also put to work, and vaccines are being developed. People are working on vaccines. There's collaboration between disciplines, and also organization-wise, you can say that patients, they are insured. There is care available. So from a healthcare system, very narrow healthcare system perspective, you would say that there's not that much to be learned. It seems to be flexible and effective, but it will take obviously quite long for the vaccine to be developed. But that has always been the case because it takes quite a long time. Also in previous pandemics and outbreaks. What we can learn, however, is that lifestyle and how healthy people are greatly affects the outcome for individuals and their health. So that is a lesson that the healthcare system could take from this. How can we prepare individuals better for such pandemics based on their own health and other kinds of indirect health interventions?
Okay, and Teun, I think you can. This also relates to you, I would say. This question.
Yeah, I think so too. It's a very interesting question, and I think so. Part of this is also about what type of knowledge we've been developing before about these outbreaks. Of course, all the biomedical knowledge and like a lot of effort is being put into that, of course, but that's going to be specific to this pandemic. The kind of more knowledge systems learning that Linda is focusing on, those are the kind of things that become transferable. I mean, personally, one of my big puzzles have been how come that the WHO, who have developed a values charter based on such previous experiences, in which they basically say promote health, keep the world safe, serve the vulnerable. This has been developed over decades based on the experience that if something happens, so much attention goes to that specific problem that you forget about all the other problems and you forget about the vulnerable groups. And this is really one of the learnings that seems to have been undone in the immediate responses. And I think that is a very interesting puzzle. I mean, we now hear things about possibly 500,000 extra HIV/AIDS deaths in Africa. We hear figures projected about possibly 300,000 deaths per day because of an emerging food crisis, which I think is roughly the number we've had worldwide now due to COVID-19. So it's about what we've learned, but also what mechanisms do we have to mobilize that learning at times that are so critical and when there's the high urgency to act on this particular problem. So I think it's a very important question, Sergio.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Teun. Sergio, is this a bit? Is this helpful for you?
Oh yes, it was really helpful and very insightful. Thank you so much.
Okay. Barbara, perhaps you can, because I know you prepared some discussion questions.
Oh yeah, I thought you also. I will. Yeah. Did you also?
No, I know.
To Mitzi and Evelien or not?
Yeah, the problem was that you actually answered to them and said, "Great, thanks, Mitzi and Evelien. Looking forward to discussing this further." And I thought you mentioned during your next webinar. Yes, but
I can respond briefly.
Okay, good.
So of course, Mitzi, thanks for. I think we should really also talk about gender equality, and also. I mean, you pinpoint the bias in me selecting a picture of a man carrying bricks rather than a woman. So we should talk about that more. Evelien's question, I think for me, transdisciplinary research should aim to be transformative research, which means that we do really need to think about who is responsible, but rather than only looking, I mean, it's really important, like who's responsible according to society, according to scholarship, according to themselves, and how can our research contribute to creating ownership and agency in those people that can help mitigate these negative effects. So I think a large part of transdisciplinary research is doing that, really trying to not only include end users or kind of those affected at the margins, but also those actors that are supposed to be doing something and implementing, those boundary partners. How can we engage them and what do they feel their responsibility is, and how can we help create ownership at all different levels? So this is a great kind of entrance for also the webinar and to be continued then. So of course there's all kinds of specific questions that will be discussed in all the webinars. We did think of some overarching questions for today. I will briefly introduce them, and then the idea is at the end, it's 3 questions that you indicate in the chat function which one you would preferably discuss in the remainder of this webinar. So we can kind of make a choice on the basis of that. The first one, why is it not clicking? Is about, it really relates, I think, to the knowledge and innovation system webinars, how to carefully shape knowledge inclusion and sense making, using, as Jacqueline said, both the requirements of systems thinking and transdisciplinary research, but particular, of course, in this case, while risks are high and urgent action is needed. So we really need to think, because often the critique is, oh, but participation takes such a long time and we need to do it carefully and we need to prepare and everybody needs to, kind of get engaged, get to know each other, frame reflection needs to happen. So there's already quite a lot of criticism sometimes on these aspects of transdisciplinary research, and now of course the criticisms get even higher, or actually we should phrase it differently. We now really have the chance to prove, to try and show what the positive effects are on the shorter term if you try and do this together from the very start. But this is still a challenge, so I think it's an interesting discussion point. The second one is how to increase the social robustness of knowledge, so including experimental expertise, public expertise, as Frank indicated, social sciences, whilst, well, at least earlier political discourse pointed towards a narrow group of experts, i.e. virologists, epidemiologists. Of course, it's shifting now a little bit, but that's only after 2 months. So can we have a discussion about this kind of dominant discourse versus the needed discourse in terms of the needed evidence? And the third question is about how can we maintain the wins. So we see, for instance, when we talk about the large effects at the margins, we also see a lot of social innovation. But also in terms of sustainability, of course, we see a lot of rapid action on saying, well, this is much more sustainable, staying at home, not traveling that much. We must, and whenever we're going to fund companies, they must also invest in sustainability. How can we actually really make this happen and maintain those wins after lockdown? So those are 3 questions that we thought of. So please now use the chat function to indicate what you would like to discuss. You can just type a number.
I see that Kevin has done quite a bit of typing. But I don't know to what extent, if I see it quickly, it's not directly related to one of the discussion points. Kevin, can you come in?
It's related to the third.
To the third, yes.
Yeah, how you maintain the wins and how you keep investing in order to secure that those wins don't get lost once the storm has passed.
Yeah, so go ahead and because otherwise we all have to read, so you can just elaborate the point a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, a striking feature of crisis like this is that, of course, when the crisis is on, everyone is rushing to do work on it and find a vaccine, find treatment, change the system, invest more in ventilators, etc. Then after 2 months, after a few months that the crisis has passed, no one talks about it anymore, and it becomes so all the investments that went into the health system, well, politicians says, well, but should we spend all those money? We don't have an outbreak anymore. We should put it somewhere else, like cutting the income tax. But then after 20 years, you are again in another outbreak. And then you feel that you are not prepared, that you haven't invested enough money. But again, if you say we have to invest more money in building ICU beds in a moment in which the crisis is not imminent, the majority of the population or politicians will say, well, it's not worth it. Why should we put all those money for a problem that we don't have at the moment? Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's also referring, the SARS vaccine, what you mentioned, is that it was stopped basically because at that point they thought, well, it's all, so yeah, keeping the structures in place. Linda, I see that you raise your hand.
Yeah, so what we did as a study at Athena is also, we looked into what efforts went into Ebola before the outbreak in 2014 occurred. So it's the other end of the spectrum, but it raises the same question. So we looked into the patent literature to see what type of arguments did people use to file for a patent. So a patent is very costly. to file, to maintain. So what type of arguments did they use? And they used all these arguments of preparedness. So many of them mentioned the medical unmet need in rural African outbreaks, but also many of them mentioned the risk of Ebola being mutated to serve as a bioterroristic weapon. And others referred to the risk of it being imported in other countries. And what we saw is that there were actually different arguments used by different types of stakeholders in different geographical backgrounds based on what type of rationale was dominant to them. So if you can find out what type of rationale triggers the people who are responsible, you can use that to shape the discourse and to also make sure that you are prepared during peacetime.
Yeah, and not let the attention slip that much. Yeah. Anybody else on this point? Point 3, I saw James saying that he thought his point was interesting, but I don't know whether it was just a general remark or that you would like to add something to it.
No, it's kind of both. It's a general remark, but my father just wrote an editorial on sustainable decision systems, and I read that just the other day, and I just thought this perfectly links to what you're discussing. So I was very happy to see the question or the point flagged up.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anybody else on the third point? Then I see that Thomas, you would like to discuss the first one. Can you kick it off?
Well, in the sense that when there are urgent decisions made, what we see across different countries, when they made those urgent decisions, they made them based on their policy values. So they made them on their societal values. So a very, very striking difference. The Dutch safeguarded their children from the beginning. So they did not limit the mobility of the children. Of course, there's also data about it, that the children's transmission is limited, but it's also, I think, based on the value of that the children should be mobile, active, and so and so. Whereas there are other countries which limited the children's mobility to reduce the transmission rates, although they are not vulnerable. This makes it, and in these times of crisis, when you need to make urgent decisions, these are usually based on the existing values, and being aware of them actually helps a lot. I mean, yes, we cannot have these dialogue sessions and all these participatory methods in the first and urgent rapid responses, but if we know those underlying policy values, it might help a lot actually to reflect on it and look back, what did we value most when we were making those decisions? So that would be my answer to the question, discussion 1, or a kickoff.
Anybody else who would like to step in and react? I don't know whether you are eagerly, because I can't see everybody in my view.
No, I understand.
So unless you unmute yourself, I don't mind if you unmute yourself at that point and say, I have something to say.
Yes. I mean, I think, Thomas, it's very interesting. I think you're making a very good point that a lot of the sort of sense making is partly incorporated in the decisions as you see them being taken by the different governments. I mean, of course, we have an idea about Sweden not having taken much action. Having lived in Sweden for 4 years, you also realize that taking much less action but appealing to people's own responsibility will have a much stronger effect even in Sweden than it will have here. Because of a very strong sense of collective. So in a way you're saying, and I like that point a lot, there's a lot of knowledge inclusion and sense making in the political discourse and the policy values, because that is in a way where they grow from. And of course the counter question is, what do you still do with all the values and the people that fall out of that framing? Because those are also there. So, but I think it's a good nuance. There is already a lot of social in those decisions.
Yeah, but at the same time, what you saw in the Netherlands, and I don't know how that plays out in other countries, is that there was a lot of awareness of public opinion. and so the license to operate, so the whole idea of acceptance. What you saw at one point is that the schools closed down, not because of the scientific evidence, and it was clearly stated, we don't do it now because of scientific evidence, but because so many parents don't want to send their children to school under these uncertain circumstances. We do feel that they're safe, but they don't feel they're safe, so okay, we're going to do it. And also regularly they seem to have done opinion polls just to try to find out how people thought about certain measures. So I think in the Netherlands we see a kind of, still some kind of transdisciplinarity, but in a very narrow sense. So it's the consultation thing. So quick consultation through public opinion polls, which is also, I think, a very interesting development that you, at least for the Netherlands, with the poldering things, it might also be highly cultural, huh? There. Yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, well, and I even think that the Netherlands is, I mean, looking also at the other countries, the one which is more at the forefront, you know, just to say how bad the others are doing. And also I see in the public debate, there's sometimes it's also difficult to have open conversations about values. I mean, in Italy, for example, now there's the big question, why are we reopening factories and we are not reopening theaters, given that our country lives more on tourism than factories? And of course, no member of the government feels comfortable going on TV and saying, look, we are actually placing less value on those who do a more artistic job rather than those who produce steel or something else. So some of the cultural and value arguments are actually quite embarrassing to have in an open debate sometimes.
Yeah. So some issues are difficult to do. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is actually, I would rather take it as an opportunity to make these policy values visible. So it should be taken as an opportunity to put it as a mirror in the face of the society, saying that this is how you are making decisions in times of these pressure times, and this is what you value more than the other. And of course, this also is very important when you're making cross-country comparisons, because Sweden, at many of the times, we assume that these decisions are made based on data and fact, and so, but they're actually quite dependent on the values as well. What is taking on the desk, and how it is filtered, and etc., and what is considered viable. The other thing is that the politicians, of course, seek for votes and the public opinion, and then apparently the majority, the majority value of a country becomes the dominant value system, becomes the one that is that takes the most weight, and that's quite normal. But then what about those in the margins that we care a lot about at Athena Institute, of course? It doesn't mean that the decisions they can really slip very easily out of the radar when the majority value is taken as
exactly. That actually is an important argument to do these kinds of things in a more transdisciplinary way, where you pay attention to the diversity. Indu, you raised the point about also this issue, about the first point. Can you?
Now we see a lot of publications on COVID-19, and most of them are kind of isolated, confined to a specific sector, like medicine or public health. That's different, and the food is different, for example. So, but then when we gather the evidence, how do we kind of make sense of those evidence from more transdisciplinary or the interdisciplinary perspective, because they are isolated, and how do we kind of understand them as a holistic, in a kind of more holistic sense? So yeah, I think that's the question.
I think that would be, Indu, that's a very good question that I would like to ask Teun to address.
Yes. Yes, it is indeed a very good question, because of course very often the hope that is there, that this evidence is kind of summative, that you can sort of add it up. But obviously, very often it's going to be conflicting. It's going to be coming not just to different conclusions, but to actually ones that contradict each other. The solution that has mostly been followed by this in the people who tried to bring this together within guideline development has been to use study design as a kind of a hierarchy to order these different types of knowledge, and then take the causal explanatory factor as sort of being definitive in what counts most. You see especially in public health, in outbreak guidance, there has been a series of quality appraisal tools, for example, developed that is able to appraise knowledge more in terms of its own value. So not measuring everything with the same stick. And that means that the work of integrating that those very different types of knowledge really is a professional expertise in itself, which especially amongst outbreak guidance people, that's the thing they try to cultivate amongst each other. But it's hard because they're operating in a world that is defining good knowledge based on the type of study design. So very often, if they follow the current methods for guideline development, they end up saying all our best knowledge starts out being poor quality or low confidence. That's not a very nice starting point for the conversation with your experts. So there's a challenge there. There's of course also a challenge for us. I mean, I think one of the interesting examples from Ebola is this guidance that I think the WHO followed quite consistently, that previous outbreaks have shown that you should not impose travel bans because they are going to frustrate aid relief, and people are going to travel anyway. And if they travel anyway, they will do so under the radar, and it will be harder to do contact tracing. Now, I think that is a very nice way where they sort of took into account all kinds of societal dynamics and different types of knowledge into a type of guidance that I think by now we can say Taiwan did the right thing by closing the borders real early. So this integration does mean that the knowledge is going to be very situated as well. And then we have to keep looking at what are the mechanisms that led to a kind of decision, and do those mechanisms still apply? So yeah, it's partly a technical answer and partly just pointing to the puzzle we're in.
And the interesting thing, of course, is in those plural situations that in the end, what you will get that there were always some people were right. And they will claim, I said you so, I told you so. But at that point in time, when that was said, it was not that clear at all. Yeah, so it's again the fog that we are in at the moment. Yeah. I think we're very close to the end of the session now. There were no pressing questions in the chat. I think we had a pretty good appetizer of what to expect in the webinar series, and I hope you got inspired and to the sense energized to say, okay, I would really like to perhaps all of the webinars, or at least some of the webinars I would like to attend. And so we hope to see most of you back already this coming Thursday, because then we have the second webinar that Linda is going to host. And I'm pretty sure, based on your pitch, that you will make it a very interesting one and a challenging one, taking a different perspective again. So I'm pretty sure that each of the webinars will have a quite different perspective, and that from all these different perspectives, you will get a wonderful overview of the many relevant aspects related to the COVID-19, which after all, though it's close to all of our hearts because we're all so much affected by it, directly, I would say, all from home, right? So it's a good way of discussing many of these issues which are so central to most of our work already for so many years. So this is a great opportunity to rethink everything. Oh, Frank, rethink. It is a good name for a project, isn't it? Okay, to transform and rethink. Okay, we hope to see you back, and have a nice day. Bye, everybody.
You too, thank you.